Muchas gracias, Jose. So I want to first thank our Spanish hosts and CEU for this very fine event. A lot of thought and energy has been exerted in this, and I'm very pleased to be here in Madrid. So thanks again for the invitation. I'll get straight to my points. I want to give you a little food for thought this morning, and hopefully it'll inspire a few questions. So I'll be speaking about the transition in Croatia, why it has been so difficult, and maybe lessons we can learn from the events in 1989 and the early 90s. I myself grew up in the United States. My parents are Croatian immigrants who fled communism, so I didn't personally live under the horrific experience of the communist rule, but I have been living in Croatia since the early 90s for over 30 years. I can speak from firsthand experience about the harm this ideology caused. So happily, the sudden collapse of communism in 1989 transpired peacefully in Central Europe, but not in Croatia, where we were confronted by a bullying and aggressive Serbia, which was determined to achieve its imperialistic ambitions. Hardline communists exchanged their old ideology very easily, quickly, for a new nationalist one aimed at creating a greater Serbia. Thus, Croatia had to achieve two liberations in the 1990s. The first being the physical liberation of our occupied territory, and the second being the mental liberation from decades of Marxist indoctrination. It seems in hindsight that the second liberation has proved to be the more difficult one. For example, it took over 25 years for Croatia to remove the name of the communist dictator Tito from one of the main squares in Zagreb. And this act provoked a lot of discussion, and many intellectuals on the left still today were opposed to this move, still acting as apologists for a communist dictator, while at the same time they described themselves as defenders of human rights, these same people. So the question obviously is what about Tito's victims? Do they deserve some attention? From the beginning, the communists relied on terror to grab and consolidate power. This has been the same pattern that we've heard about also yesterday in many other countries. One example I will give you just among many on the island of Daksa near the beautiful city of Dubrovnik. I'm sure many of you have visited. The communists in October 1944 executed 45 people, including 8 priests, without a trial. No one was ever prosecuted for this atrocity. The great British novelist Evelyn Waugh, who was serving in Dubrovnik in the British Army at the time, described the situation as follows in his report. In Croatia, a predominantly Catholic country, is falling under a predominantly communist rule. Great Britain has a responsibility for the solution of the problem raised. A communist minority is consolidating its control. The Yugoslav Army of National Liberation, popularly called the Partisans, is an organized revolutionary army whose main characteristics are extreme youth, ignorance, hardiness, pride in the immediate past, confidence in the immediate future, intolerance of dissent, xenophobia, comradeship, etc. I won't go on, it's a long quote. Waugh's observations caused quite a stir in the British Foreign Office, which did not wish to be too critical of Tito's partisans. In response to Waugh's report, the British ambassador at the time, Stevens, remarked that local conditions cannot be judged by Western standards. That's the British ambassador. Also, I would remind you that many people who act as defenders of the Yugoslav model of communism say that gradually things got better and more tolerable. The last state-ordered assassination took place in February of 1990. So this extreme abuse of power to the point of executing people who appeared to be enemies of the state, this was happening till the very end of the regime until it collapsed. So there was no, in my mind, there was no real change in the way things were governed in the 80s, including the 80s. It was a brutal reality till the very end. Unfortunately, I must say that Croatia has not prosecuted a single crime from the communist period. Only thanks to pressure from Germany were two leading figures from the Yugoslav secret police finally tried and convicted for the murder of Stjepan Đureković, which was committed in 1983 in Munich. And there was great resistance in Croatia to extradite the culprits who were eventually convicted. So it's, in my view, a tragic irony that the nation that suffered, Croatia, under this awful communist regime has not had the strength to confront the crimes of communists. I hosted a conference myself in 2009, marking the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And one of the panels dealt with the crimes of communism. And the president of Croatia at the time, Stjepan Mesić, objected to this panel. I invited him to come and speak, and he said crimes of communism is an oxymoron. So he was still denying that any crimes even took place. And this was the Croatian president in 2009 who objected to this panel. I would also say that before I elaborate more on the legacy and what communism left behind, that we must notice that democratic liberals in the West intuitively sensed that they had a deeper bond with former communists than with anti-communists. This may sound strange, but I think it is actually true. As the Polish philosopher Richard Legutko explains in his latest book, The Demon in Democracy, former communist leaders and functionaries received very good reviews in the West, as opposed to avowed anti-communists and dissidents, who were treated far less kindly. No post-communist government, even the worst, was condemned by the European Union, while strong anti-communist governments, like the current government in Poland and in Hungary, have sparked fury of great intensity. I believe that this is not just because of disagreements over the rule of law, but rather reveals a deeper problem. These countries have a very different view of what defines the European project, what is the nature of freedom itself. And these questions must be resolved. I think it's very good and a good sign, very encouraging, that here in Madrid we have speakers from Hungary and Poland and elsewhere discussing these topics. I think in Europe we must draw the lessons from what happened and why communism in the end collapsed. I must mention St. John Paul II, who in his writings about the collapse of communism mentions the failed economic model and flagrant violations of fundamental rights. But the Holy Father says that the true cause of the new developments in 1989 was the spiritual void brought about by atheism. Marxism had promised to uproot the need for God from the human heart. But the results have shown that it is not possible to succeed in this without throwing the heart into turmoil, end of quote. So we heard yesterday, and I enjoyed very much the remarks by speakers who were explaining what communism, the theory, represented. Homo economicus, this new definition of human nature along materialistic lines. We know Marx had many hatreds for capitalism, for religion, for Slavic nations, including Croatia, and some loves. But I think it's most important to grasp his materialistic view and his very flawed philosophy of history. Incidentally, in his theory, he predicted that in the final phase, when society would achieve communism, perfect communism, a classless society, no private property, that government, the state, would wither away. It would become superfluous and disappear. But in fact, as we know, governments became totalitarian, all-powerful. And this is clear because it's not possible to have such mass violence and killing and confiscation of property without complete control and oppression of the people. So it's the same pattern everywhere, and I tell my students it's wrong to believe that the theory itself was in some way noble and idealistic, even some say compatible with Christianity. Recently, in the readings at Mass, we hear in the Acts of the Apostles how the early Christians were sharing with each other. But this is not socialism or communism. This is more the familial model, as in a family. You share the common good among each other for the sake of the family. But it's not a justification for massive confiscation of private property. And so I think many people still confuse this today. And so, in other words, my message, one of the first main points I want to make is that it was not just a theory that was poorly implemented by people who didn't understand what Marx meant. No, the theory itself, written on paper, couldn't propose something that must have ended badly. So in other words, we didn't have to experience the gulags and all the persecutions to know that this was a very bad idea, what Marx was proposing. But I think young people in the West, in the United States, where I grew up, need to hear these messages, because I'm afraid they're quite naive and being seduced by something very dangerous. So, communism in reality was a massive attack on the human personality as such, since it could not control or contain on a large scale individuals who describe or understand themselves as free persons. Absolute conformity was a necessity for the survival of the system, and the authorities simply could not tolerate persons who acted spontaneously or outside their given role in society. Dissidents were not allowed to read certain novels even while serving time in prison. I met one of my early acquaintances in Croatia was an older professor and academic, Ivan Supicic, who told me that he received a copy of a book by Jacques Maritain in the late 1940s. And books like this were obviously banned in former Yugoslavia, but he was so enamored by the book and it captivated his imagination, and he was afraid that he would get caught with it, that he actually transcribed the entire book, wrote every word himself, word by word, just to have a copy of his own, and then got rid of the book. So this is something students can hardly imagine today in universities, the danger of reading certain literature. And how far does this madness go, this kind of ideology, if it's backed by sufficient political power? Well, one example from Albania, the first cardinal from the country of Albania, Mikel Koliki, who was named by John Paul II in 1994. He was already in his early 80s. He, as a young priest, was arrested in Albania for the crime of listening to Vatican radio, and he spent 38 years in labor camps, completely isolated from society. And the important point from Koliki's example is it did not destroy his faith. He found a way to celebrate Mass daily under these conditions, and left prison, I think in the late 80s, with his mental health intact. So I think this is an inspiring story, and it's a shame that Hollywood and other places don't find an interest in these real examples of people who suffered tremendously and retained their faith in God, despite the circumstances. Okay, let me move forward because I want to stay on time. So, as in other Central European nations, Croatia's natural, organic, cultural development was disrupted, first in 1918 after World War I, but more significantly in 1945. And I think the show trial of Blessed Cardinal Stepinac, who Jose in his introduction kindly mentioned, revealed to people really what they were facing immediately. This was in 1946. The communists could not bear the witness of such a powerful, inspiring figure in the church. And so Tito ordered a trial. After Stepinac refused to yield to his demands regarding the status of the Catholic Church, he went to prison and died in 1960, refused to leave Croatia. When he was named a cardinal in 1952 by Pius XII, Tito broke off diplomatic relations with the Holy See. A prominent leader of the party at the time, and later a dissident, Milovan Đilas, stated that Stepinac would never have been brought to trial had he not continued to oppose the new communist regime. And he was eventually convicted for high treason and war crimes. It is, on a positive note, very good that the Croatian justice system in the 1990s abolished this conviction, at least formally abolished, and pronounced Stepinac as innocent. But this was just one example of how ruthless the communists were, especially towards institutions they found threatening. And that, of course, was, in Croatia's case, the Catholic Church, first and foremost. I want to make a few remarks about how to understand ideology as such, political ideologies. I think in reality, they assume many social functions of religion. So it would perhaps be more precise to talk about political religions, because that's how they act out in reality. They attempt to give meaning, ultimate meaning, to people's lives. I think that's something we can see in the West with woke ideology, just how militant these ideologues are in spreading and imposing nonsense on children, for example. So this is something the communists obviously implemented. There was mass indoctrination starting at the elementary school levels. But this is something we see in the West as well. I mean, how can something as crazy as gender ideology spread without indoctrination of children? No one would naturally be spreading. Parents would not be naturally raising their children in a way. But if the left, if these ideologues get control of public institutions, public education, that's what interests them most, then anything is possible. Abuses without the consent of parents are happening on a regular basis. And I think it is good, Ken Pope yesterday mentioned cancel culture. Of course, communism was cancel culture on steroids. They were killing people who disagreed with it. So what can we learn from what are the lessons we can learn? Well, it would be ironic if China, still a communist country, was the place where the lessons were best grasped, because China, I think, understands very well what was happening below the surface in Central Europe before communism collapsed. The visits, the papal visits of John Paul II to Poland, the first in 1979, this sparked really the dynamics that could not be later changed by any amount of political force. And so it's not a coincidence that China does not want the Holy Father to visit China. Western bankers, Western companies, CEOs, business know-how, that's all very welcome in China. You can make money, you're welcome if you're a CEO of Apple or Google or Facebook or a Western bank. But if you're the Holy Father, a religious leader in Rome, you are not welcome. So I think that this is a major lesson, that they find that they can do business with Western capitalists, but with religious leaders who perhaps have a very different view of human dignity and human nature, it's not compatible. Communism is completely incompatible with this kind of view of the human being. One observer who wrote very articulately on this issue of ideologies and how they influence and undermine Christian culture was the English historian Christopher Dawson. If you've not heard of him, I urge you to Google him. He was, in my view, one of the greatest English speaking historians of the 20th century. But he very early on observed that ideologies were threatening to actually remove religion from the public sphere and to replace them. So he saw basically communism or fascism, presumably today woke ideology, as substitute religions. And this is how we should understand them, because there's no room to compromise. Neutrality is not an option. Only naive people can believe that neutrality or some kind of weak liberalism can protect our fundamental freedoms. This is very naive. If Dawson is correct, and I think he is. So the yearning for transcendental meaning and purpose never fades away. It always finds new and menacing expression in substitute faith. I'm almost finished. This is my final, sorry. Usually in philosophical and political forms. So one must view the rise of political religions in this way. Dawson was prophetic in seeing that a totalitarian solution would appeal to democracies, not just to authoritarian societies. And this is, I think, something we saw during COVID. Many politicians and company leaders willing to exploit a pandemic for their own interests, and massive populations willing to comply. And we must learn the lessons from this as well. So finally, just a food for thought. We must stay strong, not yield an inch to the left on culture. We must defend what is most important and congregate at events like this, and that's why I'm very pleased to be here. And I think with collaboration and enough strength and courage, we can hopefully preserve our Western civilization. So thank you very much.